Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Friday, September 23rd. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Wisconsin game is tomorrow, the game against Michigan in 64 days. It is that time of the week again. We are talking scheme today with one of Buckeye Huddle's X's and O's gurus, Ross Fulton. There was a lot to learn from last week's game, a little to look ahead for this week's game. He wrote all about it at BuckeyeHuddle.com this week, and now he's here to break down some of that for us. Ross, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, Tom.
So you wrote this week about something that Ryan Day did to counteract one of the things opposing defenses have been just loved doing against the Buckeyes, which is play their corners soft so that they can be much more aggressive with their safeties in the run game. So what did Ohio State do to sort of counteract that? What was the counterpunch there for Ohio State? And then how well did it actually work?
Yeah, no, I mean, they came out early and really worked. I sometimes sort of use the shorthand, like vertical stem routes. Routes where the outside receiver is running vertically and then comes back, or whether it's a hitch or an out route. So right away they used, run pass options where Stroud's reading the cornerback pre-snap, and if he's soft, he's going to pull it and throw it to the wide receiver. They also ran some drop back, like a little bit deeper outs. And so, targeting early and often that soft corner coverage, and just the general desire of Toledo, which was similar to Notre Dame, and really trying to bracket or muddy the middle of the field to limit Jackson Smith and Jigba specifically, but just Ohio State's interior passing game generally.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was one of the very clearly one part of their game plan was trying to bracket Jackson Smith and Jigba, take him away from Ohio State. He is obviously sort of the central feature of that Ohio State passing game, or at least in theory. It hasn't really worked out that way so far this year. That may change this weekend, but, can you explain a little bit more when you say they were bracketing him? What does that mean? And then what did Ohio State do in response to get him open a few times?
Yeah, I mean, so bracket, in the literal sense of the term, usually you're going to have someone on the outside of him and then in the inside. So oftentimes, like in cover 4, for instance, that we've talked about, Jim Knowles literally likes using a cover 4 coverage called bracket, where the, underneath defender is going to play that receiver with outside leverage, and then you have the safety over the top of them or on inside routes. But you don't even need to literally be in man. You can just simply, have someone lined up on his outside shoulder who's sticking with them, and then the safety is going to come down. But, it could be other coverages too. Like we talked about after Notre Dame, like they played cover 1 cross, which meant that like the opposite side safety would come down on like, inside or shallow crossing routes. You can do playing cover 2 just because you have a bunch of underneath defenders. So there's different and 2 deep safety. So, there's different variations, and, just kind of using bracket as a shorthand. But basically, like, you could even see it just in terms of even not even necessarily at a scheme level, but also just like at a personnel level. Like, you can see Toledo like being like, oh, that's number 11. Like, we better go with that guy. So, like, on the throw on Stroud's pass to Marvin Harrison that I highlighted, and that, a lot of people talked about how it was barely over the tip of the, the outstretched hands of the cornerback coming back. But, like, 2 guys jumped with Smith and Jigba, which just left Harrison running across the field free. So his impact is pretty significant. And, we talked about that following Notre Dame, but it's probably still underrated, the impact him being out had on the Ohio State passing game.
All right, so that's the Ohio State passing game. Now let's talk a little bit about the Ohio State running game. And you wrote about what you feel is Ohio State's most effective run play so far this year. So what is that, and how much of the success in that play is based on the offensive line versus the backs and how it worked for them versus any other factors that might play into it?
Yeah, well, I would say their most effective run play this year has been their most effective run play under Ryan Day and Kevin Wilson. And it's their base run play, really, which is outside zone or stretch, whatever term you want to use, particularly from the pistol, particularly running it to the boundary or short side of the field, when they put, the tight end into the boundary and the wide receivers to the field. So, it's partially their most effective play because it's what they spend a lot of time practicing, and it's what they sort of hang their hat on. But it also, particularly when they're running right this year, fits well with their personnel because you have DeJuan Jones at the point of attack, and then you take advantage of the athleticism of Donovan Jackson and Paris Johnson the backside in terms of running, literally turning your shoulders to the sidelines and running and cutting off blockers or cutting off defenders. So it definitely plays into that. But so, yeah, you have that sort of mesh or meld of this is our base concept, it fits well, especially running right, but you have that sort of as your number one concept, and then probably you would say duo has been their secondary run concept, and so those are the two things that they hang their hat on.
How would you grade out the overall performance of the offensive line so far this year? It feels like they've been running the ball better. They've been protecting C.J. Stroud pretty well. This is in line with three guys in different spots than they were last year, so there was a lot of turnover, and so there was a little bit of a question there. But how would you grade things out on the offensive line so far?
Yeah, good. There's certainly room for improvement. I think DeJuan Jones has certainly been their best offensive lineman. There's times that I think he could finish his blocks better, but I think in terms of both pass protection and run game, he's been at the best. I think you certainly see the inexperience of the left side. I think there's been some stuff that Paris Johnson needs to clean up in terms of his pass sets and handling different moves. And I think him and Donovan Jackson working together, like there's areas for improvement. I think they probably played their best game thus far against Toledo, and so I think it's good. I like some of the changes that Justin Fry's brought in terms of how they're handling double teams, how they're, again, what we just talked about in terms of running on wide zone. But I think, a key, especially for Jackson and Johnson, is to they need to establish the double team at the first level before guys try to jump off to linebackers.
All right, so now let's flip to the other side of the ball. One thing that I found really interesting in your article this week is, despite the fact that the bullet really isn't a thing anymore, there's no position called the bullet. And if there was, Ronnie Hickman's not really playing that position anymore. He's at a different spot on the field, regardless of what you call it. But still, he ends up sort of in that role sometimes, in, what was the old bullet role. So can you explain what causes that, and, how has that worked out for the Buckeyes so far this season?
Yeah, okay. So if we had a diagram, right? So, what the bullet was supposed to be was essentially a hybrid between a Sam linebacker and a safety, right? So if you have your traditional 4-3, so now if you're going to a 4-2-5, you still have a safety that is around the slot receiver or at the second level, I would say, right? If you still have two deep safeties. So this year, they're in theory, if you put a diagram of Knowles's 4-2-5 up, the guy replacing the Sam linebacker is the nickel who would be covering the slot receiver. So that's, Tanner McAllister and last week Cam Martinez. But what they do at times, and we saw it a lot against Notre Dame too, is they invert them. And so you get Ronnie Hickman a lot. You'll get the bandit, quote unquote, the boundary safety doing it some too, but they will be the ones who come down the box, and then they rotate the nickel back to be a deep safety, particularly in run situations or when the offense is in 12 personnel. So we talked about preseason, are they going to bring in a third linebacker? Are they going to play Court Williams instead of, pull out the nickel? And instead what they've done thus far largely is just count on Ronnie Hickman and, to also Lathan Ransom / Josh Proctor to be able to essentially come down and fill that role. And so they've shown a lot more versatility. It's not like the nickel just needs to be can only play man coverage in the slot. Compared to 2019, they never pulled Sean Wade really out of the slot, right? He was always there. Now, Tanner McAllister, Cam Martinez, they're deep safeties quite a bit.
All right, so that was some real nitty-gritty nuts and bolts scheme stuff. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit with a question that people will hopefully not have to think I can just picture people rewinding on their podcast app like 3 times to go through all of that. But I want to give people an answer to a question that I'm sure they were walking away with at the end of the game last week, which is, okay, they gave up some big plays on the ground to the quarterback run, gave a couple of big pass plays, and I think everyone has now heard Jim Knowles say like, well, some explosive plays are going to happen, and that's just kind of the cost of doing business the way he does business. When you have a quarterback making guys miss like that, when you're giving up big pass plays, with your starting corners going against MAC level receivers, is that a concern to you? And if so, what is causing that, or is it just kind of you just kind of view it the way Jim Knowles does, which is like, yeah, this is just kind of the cost of doing business.
So let's split them out, right? Let's talk about the pass plays first. So the last one on Denzel Burke, I mean, that to me is like you kind of throw your hands up like a little bit. Like it's sort of like he chucked it up in the air. The guy comes back to it. I mean, it's, I guess you probably would want to see Burke make a better tackle attempt on that. To me, that's sort of like, sometimes you check it up and it works out. It was not a good decision on the quarterback's part. The first one, it's a little hard given the route distribution. It was not like, to me, that's not really on Cam Brown. Like he's playing, it's a little hard to tell. It's a 5-man blitz. They're either in cover 1 or they're in a cover 3. Either way, like there's supposed to be a deep post safety in the middle of the field there because Brown's playing with outside leverage. And so you expect your safety to come pick it up. And, the guy who was in the middle of the field, Cam Martinez, like he carried the deep cross across the field. And so then like he and Latham Ranson, who was on the other third, like ended up basically doubling that guy, and Cam Brown had no help. So one of those two guys should be back. And so again, it's like, sometimes it's hard with the TV cameras and you see the corner running behind a guy and it's like, oh, that corner got beat. And it's like, well, it's not necessarily that simple. Like it's, a team concept. So all this is to say that like there's a lot of storm and drung about the corners right now. I really don't see them as like being a huge problem. I wouldn't want to like, they have no depth there. So I wouldn't want to like push past the starters too much, but I don't think it's like a cause for huge alarm. In terms of the running, so like Knowles I talked about in my article, Knowles used, his concept was that they were going to rush Finn from the outside and force him up the field. And then up the field you have, spies, quote unquote, one on the touchdown run, there were essentially 3 because you had like 2 underneath hot defenders, and then you make the tackle. Now, the problem was that like they didn't execute it, right? Like those spies didn't get the guy to the ground. And so then I think the question becomes, and only Jim Knowles can answer that, like, are these concepts sound? And like, did we just not execute them? Or like, next time this comes up, do I need to treat this differently? Because like in theory, the concept worked, but in practice, we couldn't execute it. So, at the time, like watching live, I was like, well, what are they, like, why are you, this is crazy. Like you're rushing 2 guys, like Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, both outside the tackle. And he's like, okay, I'll just run right up the middle for the touchdown. Thank you. But like, when you see it, you can see the concept. It's like, no, we're trying to force him up in the pocket, and Steel Chambers is sitting there. He beat Steel Chambers. So I think, again, I guess it's sort of, I can see the concept, and then I think the question is like, well, if you're going to leave your will line like one-on-one with a bunch of space, like how athletic's that quarterback going to be, there's only so many guys that can run like that. The problem is that there are a few coming on their schedule. I mean, JJ McCarthy can probably do that, and frankly, I think Stetson Bennett could do that too if you ever end up playing Georgia and you give him that much space. So again, I think there's different ways to defend a running quarterback, and my gathering from listening to Knowles was, maybe it's going to be back to the drawing board a little bit on it.
Yeah, I always feel like if there's a guy there, then the coaches have done their job, and then it's kind of on that guy to get the guy, get the opposing ball carrier to the ground. So it felt like there was generally a guy there, which I would read as a good sign for the as for the defense on the whole. But yeah, that you got to get him with ground. Otherwise, having a guy there just means there's someone who fans are yelling at when they see him chasing someone in the end zone.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, again, it's like, well, there's a guy there, but if it's like Javonte Jean-Baptiste, like, can we really expect a defensive end with that much space to get the quarterback to the ground when he has a two-way go and can juke you? I mean, so you got to put people in position too where they can make plays.
All right, and so they will be trying to put themselves in position to make plays this weekend. Wisconsin presents a sort of a different challenge on both offense and defense. We talked before the show, and you said more to talk about on the defense. So let's talk about what kind of challenges does Wisconsin's defense present to the Ohio State offense this week?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex scheme, right? I mean, it has a lot in common in some ways with what Michigan showed Ohio State last year. Like, their base scheme is a 3-down tight front, but Jim Leonard also has his like 2-4-5, calls it a peso package. So you get a lot of, we've talked about it before, simulated pressures, creepers, where they're still rushing for, but like you don't know who's dropping, you don't know who's coming. They're really stout inside against the run. Ohio State's, I would say, like, again, you're going back a few years at this point, but like when Ohio State played them with Day there, I personally thought like a lot of the success came on the outside, like, again, running wide zone to the boundary, getting outside like sort of their big defensive tackles where they like lacked force support, or like, again, they will play Ohio State aggressively with their safeties, or like they have in the past. So you'd get soft corners because their corners cannot hold up over a game against Ohio State's wide receivers. So like, start hitting them with those outside comeback routes, and then that opens up opportunities. So it always makes for a good, because I mean, Wisconsin is like, and they are still one of the best defenses in the country, and Jim Leonard's one of the best defensive coaches. So it makes for an interesting battle. I will say for 2 seconds, it will be interesting if you flip it around. Like, again, we saw Knowles against Notre Dame, but Wisconsin, again, is he going to bring in a bigger body at nickel? Is he going to use more of the same concepts? Does he, using Ronnie Hickman essentially as your bullet, or, and then, how much we've seen some of Knowles' his concepts, but like teams have really generally struggled to run against Jim Knowles. He makes it really tough. He changes gaps around. He baits teams. He makes like offensive linemen unsure. And so I think we'll see also a lot of the jack being the jack, because Wisconsin likes to pull and run counter tray, and like Knowles mucks that up by having, the jack trace the offensive guard pulling, as I showed in my article this week.
So yeah, there will be a lot to talk about this week. It should be a very interesting matchup. There's been a couple kind of weeks where you walked into the stadium knowing Ohio State's going to win and win by a bunch of touchdowns. Not quite the case this weekend. Ohio State favored by a little under 3 touchdowns last I saw, but should be a much more competitive game, much higher quality opponent, and should be a always a fun matchup when Wisconsin comes to town. So we'll have complete pre and post game coverage at youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. Make sure you're subscribed there. Make sure you ring that bell so you get notified when we start our pregame show. And of course, we'll have our full usual post-game coverage as soon as the clock hits 0, with all sorts of insight analysis, post-game interviews, and much, much more, all at youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.